Hello ladies and gentlemen, Tevaron here, and it is that time once again. That time when all the good little boys and girls... Wait a second. This is the wrong script. Alright, here we go. Welcome friends to the Amonkhet set review, where we go card by card and try to give an educated, air quotes there, analysis of the cards coming to Magic Duels in Amonkhet. As always, a few disclaimers first. These are my opinions, and I am almost certainly going to be wrong on some of them, probably a lot of them if we're being realistic, as these are my first raw evaluations of the cards without having played any of them. In this video, we will be going through the white cards of Amonkhet, with the other groups to follow shortly. Also, just as an FYI, my voice is feeling rather scratchy today, so if that comes through in less than stellar style, I do apologize. But before we get into the cards themselves, there are some new mechanics that we should look at. First up, we have Aftermath. These are a new kind of split card, harkening back to such cards as Fire and Ice. However, with these, only one part of the card can be cast from your hand. The other half requires the card to be in the graveyard to be castable. A very interesting interaction that just screams 2-for-1 potential. Also, just so you guys know, I will be evaluating the Aftermath cards with different colored halves in the multicolored video. Next, we have Cycling. This is a mechanic I'm very excited to see back, an old crowd favorite. A card with Cycling on it allows you to pay a cost while it's in your hand and discard it to draw a new card. Cycling happens at instant speed and is a great way to get rid of a card that is not immediately useful to try to find one that is, or as a way to have fewer than 60 cards in your deck in a roundabout sort of not actually having less than 60 cards way. It is worth noting, however, that in general, the actual strength of the card's effect should be taken into account when evaluating a card with Cycling. If the card does little to nothing on its own, then it probably doesn't become an all-star just because it can cycle. On the other end of the spectrum, if the card is so powerful that you would never or hardly ever wish to cycle it, then having Cycling on it really doesn't increase its power at all. The best cards with the Cycling mechanic are cards that are situationally very useful, so that in those situations you use the actual card itself, and when you don't have one of those situations arise, you pay the Cycling cost, discard it, and draw a card. Next up, we have Embalm. When a creature with Embalm is in your graveyard, you can activate its ability, which would be to pay its Embalm cost and exile the card from your graveyard. You then create a token that's an exact copy of it, except it's a zombie with no mana cost. You can only embalm at sorcery speed. Any creature with Embalm should be considered a 2-for-1, though this is entirely negated by any effect that would exile the original creature or deal with it without killing it, such as suppression bonds. And last but certainly not least, Exert. When you attack with a creature with Exert, you can choose to exert it. What this means is you gain an additional benefit, which is described on the card itself, and the payment for that is the creature does not untap during your next untap step. Just remember, you don't have to exert, and I suspect in a lot of instances, not exerting is going to be the correct call. It is also important to note that exert is exceptionally powerful if you have Always Watching Out. As with Always Watching Out, you don't have to tap your creatures to attack. And since they never got tapped, they don't need to untap. And so in those scenarios, the Exert activation is free. And with those out of the way, let's say we actually look at some cards. First up, we have Anointed Procession. For 3 and a white, we have an enchantment. If an effect would create 1 or more tokens under your control, it creates twice that many of those tokens instead. This is not the first time we have seen this effect in Magic. Parallel Lives was printed in original Innistrad, and while being a popular enchantment in the Commander format, has never really made an impact in other constructed formats, including the original standard it was a part of, alongside such cards as Lingering Souls and Intangible Virtue. It does synergize with Embalm, but I'm just not convinced that it's enough to make this card playable. Paying 4 mana to do literally nothing unless you play another card or activate an effect that makes a token just doesn't appeal to me. Anointer Priest. 1 and a white for a 1/3 human cleric. Whenever a creature token enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life with an embalm cost of 3 and a white. Okay, first off, the fact that the life gain is limited to tokens is a big hit to the power level of this card, and the fact that it only triggers for your creature tokens doesn't help either. It does have the extra utility that Embalm provides, but the body it brings to the table isn't super impressive either. If this card had a Soul Warden type effect, and could gain a life whenever any creature entered the battlefield, then the 1/3 body for 2 would have been a big upside. As it is, I just don't think it does enough. And now, after I've said all that, I fully expect someone to break the format with this guy and Anointed Procession in a token deck, so you can all have a good laugh at how silly I was. Binding Mummy. For 1 and a white, we have a 2/2 zombie. Whenever another zombie enters the battlefield under your control, you may tap target artifact or creature. It is important to note that Binding Mummy entering the battlefield does not trigger itself, which is a bit of a downside. And in any other set, I would flat out declare this card to be not very good. However, zombies are getting a lot of love in Amonkhet. Every embalmed creature token is a zombie, and they are getting a lot more support besides that, as we will soon see. And if zombies now have the stuff to be a good deck, and honestly, they were already pretty close, then this has the potential to help push through a ton of damage. Cartouche of Solidarity. This is the first in a cycle of cartouches. Cartouche? A cycle of enchantments, let's say, coming to us in Amonkhet. On the surface, 1 mana for a +1/+1 and first strike seems like an okay rate. Add in a 1/1 token, which also has vigilance for some reason, and this seems like a solid card in an aggressive strategy. Is it enough better than what we already have, though? I'm not sure, but it and the rest of its cycle also have synergy with another cycle of enchantments in this set, the Trials, which are enchantments that have an enters the battlefield effect. The cartouches cause Trials to return to your hand, allowing you to recast them and get their effect again. So there is a lot going on here. I hesitate to say yay or nay to the playability of this card outright. I give it a solid maybe at this point. Cast Out. For 3 and a white, we have an enchantment with Flash. When Cast Out enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until Cast Out leaves the battlefield. Also has cycling of a white. Alright, so we've been asking for better ways to deal with planeswalkers in duels for a while now. And this is a great one. Not just to deal with planeswalkers, it's an instant speed Oblivion Ring of a sort, with cycling. And speaking of cycling, remember when I said if a card's so good you'll never want to cycle it? This may be just such a card. Unless you're mana screwed, I don't foresee this getting cycled very much. The almost ubiquitous nature of Reclamation Sage does lower its stock somewhat, certainly, but still absolutely thrilled with this card. And also very happy it can only exile opponents' things, because you know that if it could hit your permanents, then you'd have some jokers creating infinite loops, exiling their own cast-outs over and over and over until the game crashed, or we just wouldn't have gotten the card at all because the programmers couldn't figure out how to put it in the game without such things happening, which would have made me very sad indeed. Compulsory Rest. For 1 and a white, we have an enchantment, Enchant Creature. Enchanted creature can't attack or block, and enchanted creature has pay 2. Sacrifice this creature, you gain 2 life. This is an interesting take on a pacifism effect. Certainly less good when cast on any creature with Embalm. It still seems like a fine low-cost spot removal spell, which is again hampered somewhat by how much play Reclamation Sage sees right now. But there is a limit of 3 Rec Sage per deck, so they can only answer so many things, right? I mean, they might not have it in their hand this time, right? No, let's be honest with ourselves, they always have it. Devoted Crop Mate. For 2 and a white, we have a 3/2 human warrior. You may exert Devoted Crop Mate as it attacks. When you do, return target creature card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Okay, so our first exert creature. The exert ability aside, 3/2 for 3 is an okay rate. It's not terribly good, but the exert ability seems like it could do some good work, especially in a human's deck. The dream scenario is to bring back Athalia's Lieutenant, and since exert happens as you declare attackers, the +1/+1 counters hit all your humans before your opponent gets to declare blockers. Still, while that dream situation seems incredible, I feel the average outcome will be much worse. And I think we're going to need to put in some actual testing to see if the Crop Mate has what it takes to hang, or if it's just too slow and clunky to actually make an impact. Jeru's Resolve. 1 white for an instant. Untap target creature, prevent all damage that would be dealt to it this turn. A cycling of 2. So here we have a very situationally useful card that is most likely unplayable, except it has cycling. So in situations where you don't need it, you simply turn it into another card. I could certainly see aggressive white decks playing a couple of these for combat trickery, and being perfectly happy cycling them when they aren't needed. This is a good example of a card where cycling is at its best. Dusk to Dawn. For 2 and 2 white, we have a sorcery that destroys all creatures with power 3 or greater. Then, if the card is in your graveyard, we can cast the Aftermath side, which is Dawn. For 3 and 2 white, return all creature cards with power 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand. Here we have our first look at an Aftermath card. This card seems like something you could absolutely build around. Just play no, or very few, creatures with power greater than 2, and use Dusk as a potential one-sided board sweeper. Dawn then fuels your late game, giving you the staying power you need to prevail versus control strategies. There are very real deck building constraints though. Suddenly cards like Thalia's Lieutenant and Always Watching become much less desirable, and since it is a rare, you can only play 2, so it remains to be seen if such a strategy could actually be viable. Also a possibility is that control decks could use it as a pseudo Wrath of God. That is, if we aren't facing down weenie decks every time we queue into a match. Fanbearer is a 1 white, 1/2 zombie with the ability of pay 2 and tap it to tap target creature. Well, this is certainly a card that can hold a creature at bay, albeit in a very mana-intensive way. On the upside, it deals with embalmed creatures without putting them into the graveyard. Also, it's a zombie. On the downside, I really don't know what deck would want this. Aggro decks don't really want this effect, at least not at paying 2 mana and tapping a creature, and a creature with a very unimpressive body at that. Control has better ways to deal with threats. Sure, mid-range might like to tap down some things occasionally, but Kithion's Irregulars and Dauntless River Marshal seem to be better fits for those types of decks. This seems like a card that is great for limited play, that is sealed deck or draft, etc. But that isn't really a thing we do in Magic Duels. The only possibility I can see is if the zombie deck turns out to be a real thing, and there aren't enough low drop cards, then this could fill the gaps in that slot. Gideon of the Trials. 1 and 2 white for a 3 loyalty Gideon Planeswalker, +1 loyalty. Until your next turn, prevent all damage target permanent would deal. 0 loyalty until end of turn. Gideon of the Trials becomes a 4/4 human soldier creature with indestructible that's still a planeswalker. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to him this turn. 0, you get an emblem with as long as you control a Gideon planeswalker, you can't lose the game, and your opponents can't win the game. Okay, let's get a couple of things out of the way. First, the other Gideon, this one, is better. Second, the quote-unquote ultimate on this card, making of the emblem, might as well not even be there for all the good it's going to do you most of the time. That being said, Gideon of the Trials is a fine 3-mana planeswalker, even more so since we are limited to one-offs of mythics and duels. His +1 protects him, and you, from one enemy permanent, and it is nice that it says permanent so we can hit vehicles with it. And a 4/4 indestructible beater is a great clock. So why am I so down on the ultimate? A few reasons. Though the most relevant is that in almost any scenario where the emblem would save you, or make it so that you could win the game eventually, you would win the game anyway without it. If your opponent is in a position where you can emblem Gideon, and they can't get the Gideon off the board, you would almost certainly win anyway, apart from a very few niche situations. And even if that were not the case, we can only play 2 Gideons total in duels, one of each iteration. He's still good, especially in an aggressive shell. I can think of very few aggro decks that wouldn't very much want a 3-cost, indestructible 4/4 beat stick. Glory-bound Initiate. For 1 and a white, we have a 3/1 human warrior. You may exert Glory-bound Initiate as it attacks. When you do, it gets +1/+3 and gains lifelink until end of turn. Well, zombies aren't the only tribe that seems to be getting some love in Amonkhet. Humans are getting some shiny new toys as well. If your opponent doesn't have any good blockers, this guy just pounds in for a 3 every turn, and if they do, then swinging 4/4 lifelink every other turn seems pretty strong as well. And at 2 mana, that is a pretty good deal. The only question is it better than the 2 drops that are already available to that strategy? Sure, just like all exert creatures, it gets along very well with Always Watching, but both it and Always Watching are rare, so you can only run 2 of each. So it's far from guaranteed that you would have both of these out at the same time. I'm not saying it's a bad idea, just all things that should be considered. Gustwalker. For 1 and a white, we have a 2/2 human wizard. You may exert Gustwalker as it attacks. When you do, it gets +1/+1 and gains flying until end of turn. Another decent addition to the human garrison, or to the growing exert garrison. 2/2 ground attacks early and evasion later on in the game. But just like the previous card, does this take the slot of an already existing card in an aggro strategy? Does it slot into an as yet unbuilt strategy, exert for example? Or is it a just not quite good enough bench warmer? At this point, I'm not quite sure. I could see any of these easily being the case. In Oketra's name, for 1 and a white, we have an instant. Zombies you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. Other creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. You know, it's kind of funny how black-white seems to be the zombie-centric color pair in this set, when previously it was black-blue. Still, if zombies are competitive, this card seems like a fairly powerful finisher. 2 mana is a low cost for this effect, and instant speed is awesome. The downside is that if you don't have a decent board presence, this card is just going to sit in your hand doing nothing, and you can't just slam it and hope to draw more creatures like you can with Always Watching. But it is common, so you can run the full 4, and as such should be able to draw 1 or more copies consistently. It's all going to depend on how good zombies are, because the +1/+1 to non-zombies just isn't good enough. Oketra the True. For 3 and a white, we have a 3/6 legendary creature god. Double strike, indestructible. Oketra the True can't attack or block unless you control at least 3 other creatures. We can also pay 3 and a white to create a 1/1 white warrior creature token with vigilance. Well, the gods of Amonkhet have certainly arrived. Oketra seems very strong. Even with her requirement of having 3 other creatures to be able to attack or block, she seems like a must-answer threat. Like all the gods, she's indestructible, so we will need an exile effect to deal with her. And like all the other gods, her activated ability helps enable her attack-block condition. Pumping out 1/1 vigilance creatures seems like a great way to secure the long game in almost any deck. I am a little confused as to why the tokens she makes are warriors and not zombies. But I suppose that zombies would have been too powerful a synergy with everything else that's going on in Amonkhet. Oketra's Attendant, 3 and 2 white for a 3/3 bird soldier, with flying, cycling 2, and embalm of 3 and 2 white. I will say this, embalm certainly makes it more difficult to evaluate cards. Normally a 5 mana 3/3 flyer would only be good in limited play, but you can cycle this early on and just have it sit waiting in your graveyard until you can embalm it. Or if you draw it late, it needs to be dealt with twice. Barring exile effects, of course. My gut tells me that it should have a place somewhere, maybe in mid-range or control, although I could also see it being run in aggressive decks as a top-end threat. This card feels very versatile, and I'm looking forward to playing with it, finding out how good it really is. Regal Caracal, 3 and 2 white for a 3/3 cat. Other cats you control get +1/+1 and have lifelink. When Regal Caracal enters the battlefield, create 2 1/1 white cat creature tokens with lifelink. I feel strong echoes of Cloud Goat Ranger with this card. 5 mana for 7/7 worth of stats. 4 power of it with lifelink is super strong. And while it doesn't have any form of evasion like the Ranger, it certainly does a great job of clogging up the ground. You don't need to be running Cat Tribal to get good value out of this fuzzy feline. She brings catastrophe for your opponent all by herself. Okay, I'll show myself out now. Renewed Faith, 2 and a white for an instant that gains you 6 life. Also has cycling of 1 and a white. When you cycle Renewed Faith, you may gain 2 life. Well, Renewed Faith is a reprint, and as in the past, it's really not that good on its own. Straight up life gain with no other benefits is just not that great. Now, if only there were something that gave you additional value for cycling. Ret Crop Spearmaster, 2 and a white for a 3/1 human warrior. You may exert Ret Crop Spearmaster as it attacks. When you do, it gets +1/+0 in first strike until end of turn. Another exert human, though this one is less exciting to me. There is a possibility that swinging with 4/1 first strike every other turn is good enough. Or if you're living the dream and have always watching out, swinging with 4/1 first strike every turn. But at 3 casting cost, it's at the point that I begin to think you really want something more going on. Sacred Cat, 1 white for a 1/1 cat with lifelink and embalm of 1 white. Meow? Cat Tribal, you say? Well, maybe not, but this is a fairly solid 1-drop. Well, 2 for 1 drop, I guess you would say. Though in a world where you really want a 2/1/1, it may not be good enough. Although in a very aggressive meta, the life gain could be a game changer. Or if you are on Cat Tribal. Sparring Mummy, 3 and a white for a 3/3 zombie. When Sparring Mummy enters the battlefield, untap target creature. Nope, no thanks. This is not the 4-drop we're looking for. A 4-cost 3/3 that might as well have no other text a good percentage of the time is not what I want in any deck. Ta Crop Elite, 3 and a white for a 2/2 bird warrior with flying. You may exert Ta Crop Elite. When you do, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. It's possible that some number of these would fit into an aggressive deck, though my gut says no. 4 mana is a bit much, and as an even bigger downside, it doesn't have a relevant creature type. It's not a human, not a zombie, not a cat. Who wants to play with birds when you've got all these other wonderful choices? Those Who Serve, 2 and a white for a 2/4 zombie. And that's it. If you don't have a lot of cards unlocked and need filler for your deck, this is fine. Or maybe if zombies need a bit of fleshing out. Otherwise, there are simply better options. Time to reflect. 1 white for an instant. Exile target creature that blocked or was blocked by a zombie this turn. Have I mentioned that black-white seems to be the zombie color combination? Do we need any more proof? Forget blue. If you want to jam some zombies, white is your second color. Or maybe Esper. Yeah, Esper zombies could be a thing. Anyway, 1 mana removal, even if it is conditional, is generally incredibly powerful. And if your opponent plays around it, when you don't actually have one in hand, all the better. Trial of Solidarity, 2 and a white. For an enchantment, when Trial of Solidarity enters the battlefield, creatures you control get +2/+1 and gain Vigilance until end of turn. When a cartouche enters the battlefield under your control, return Trial of Solidarity to its owner's hand. Okay, don't get me wrong, reusable effects are great. In fact, some of the trials are great, just not this one. The sorcery speed just kills so much utility, and Oketra's name is just so much better. True Heart Duelist. For 1 and a white, we have a 2/2 human warrior. True Heart Duelist can block an additional creature each combat. Embalm of 2 and a white. So this seems like a really good rate for an embalm creature. Only 1 more mana to cast it the second time. Again though, it is in a slot on the curve that already has a lot of competition, especially in a humans deck, and the ability to block an additional creature is just not going to be relevant a large amount of the time. Maybe the zombie deck also runs embalm creatures. If so, then this is a prime candidate. Unwavering Initiate. For 2 and a white, we have a 3/2 human warrior with vigilance, and embalm of 4 and a white. Another potential card for a zombie or humans with staying power style deck. I've not had time to sit down and make deck lists yet to see what is best in each slot on the curve. 3 mana for a 3/2 with vigilance is an okayish rate, and while First Strike, like Thalia, Heretic Cathar, is a more appealing keyword, getting 2 creatures from 1 card also has a ton of value. We'll just have to wait and see. Okay, that's it. For the white cards at least. I normally do a countdown of the top cards from each color, but this time I'm going to put a bit of a different spin on it. No countdown or order, I'm just going to list the cards I'm most excited to shuffle up and try out. So in no particular order? Well, that's not true actually. In alphabetical order. Cast Out. I, and I imagine lots of others, have wanted an actual Oblivion Ring style effect for a long time now. That its flash is just icing on the cake. Dusk to Dawn. I'm not certain the card will even be that good in Duels. Seems like it would be better in a format with sideboards, but it's a really sweet design, and I'm eager to give it a shot. Oketra the True. She is pretty strong. Is her true home in aggro or control, though? I hope to find out. Regal Caracal. Meow. Enough said. Time to reflect. I am certainly a sucker for 1-cost removal, even if it is conditional. In a black-white zombie deck, you get Time to Reflect and Fatal Push, which seems like a pretty potent suite of removal to me. And that brings us to the close. What are you looking forward to playing with? Are there any cards that didn't make it in that you would like to have seen in Duels? Personally, I would have loved to see both Angel of Sanctions and Approach of the Second Sun make it into Duels, but I suppose we can't have everything. Tune in next time when we will be looking at the blue cards of Amonkhet. And until then, friends, be excellent to each other.